My wife was cheating on me in a virtual world, and when I found out she planned a virtual wedding, David and Laura had always been seen as an unconventional couple. Their marriage was built on adventure, constantly traveling, hiking, and exploring new cities together. For 10 years, they'd embraced the thrill of never staying in one place too long. But recently, things had changed. Laura had developed an obsession with virtual reality, VR, a hobby David didn't share or even understand. At first, he didn't think much of it. He wasn't into the idea of VR himself, he was more about real experiences, the feeling of the sun on his skin, the air in his lungs. Laura, though, seemed to love the escape it offered. She'd get lost in the virtual worlds, spending hours alone in her VR headset, shutting herself away in a separate room. Just a hobby, she'd say, it's not like I'm doing anything wrong. But David couldn't help but feel uneasy about how much time she was dedicating to it. He noticed she was withdrawing from him more and more. The woman who used to jump at the chance to go camping or take an impromptu road trip was now canceling their plans to stay at home in her virtual world. She'd become snappy and defensive whenever he questioned her about it, as if he was intruding on something personal. Then one day, things took a sharp turn. Laura was out of the house, and David decided to take a closer look at what had been taking up so much of her time. It was a Saturday afternoon, and he couldn't ignore the curiosity gnawing at him. Her VR headset was sitting on the coffee table, something she normally kept hidden away. He hesitated for a moment, feeling guilty for invading her privacy. But the doubt in his mind was stronger than his guilt. He had to know. When he slipped on the headset, he expected to see games or maybe some VR travel experiences, but what he found left him frozen in disbelief. The program that popped up was called Project Eden. At first glance, it seemed like another simulation, a virtual world. But as the scene loaded, he realized it wasn't just any simulation. It was a perfect replica of their home. Every detail, down to the picture frames on the wall, was an exact copy of their life together. And then he saw them, Laura and another man. They were in their living room, laughing and talking as though they'd known each other for years. His heart raced, but it got worse. In the virtual world, they weren't just friends. They were more than that. Laura was sitting close to him, her hand on his leg, gazing at him with a look David hadn't seen in years. The man called her Lila, a name David had never heard her use before. It was clear that this wasn't just a game for her. It wasn't a harmless fantasy. This was a life she had created, one where David didn't exist. For weeks, Laura had been retreating into this world. A world where she could be someone else, with someone else. And in that moment, it became clear to David that she wasn't just emotionally distant, she had replaced him in her virtual life. His mind raced. How long had this been going on? Why hadn't he seen the sign sooner? It wasn't just the VR sessions, it was everything. The late nights where she'd stay up long after he'd gone to bed, the way she no longer seemed interested in the things they used to love doing together. Every small change in her behavior suddenly made sense, and it felt like his heart was shattering into a million pieces. He couldn't bring himself to confront her right away. He needed to process what he had just seen. So, instead, he began to investigate further. David wasn't the type to jump to conclusions. He wanted to gather more evidence, to be absolutely sure before he said anything. The first thing he did was create his own avatar in the game. He named himself Alex, choosing a generic appearance so Laura wouldn't recognize him. Every night, after Laura had gone to bed, he would log into Project Eden to observe her. What he saw confirmed his worst fears. Laura was spending hours with this man, laughing, talking, sharing intimate moments, things she hadn't done with David in what felt like forever. It was as though he was watching his own life fall apart, but in a version of reality where he wasn't part of the picture. David wasn't sure how to feel. He oscillated between anger, sadness, and confusion. Part of him wanted to believe that this was all just a silly fantasy, something Laura didn't take seriously. But the emotional connection she had with this man was undeniable. He could see it in the way she looked at him, the way she hung on to every word he said. It wasn't just a game. It was an escape, a life she had built without him. David continued logging into Project Eden each night, becoming more and more consumed by what he saw. The man, whose name he eventually learned was Kyle, seemed to be everything David used to be for Laura. Charming, attentive, and always making her laugh. David could barely watch as Laura, no, Lila, acted like someone completely different from the woman he'd married. In the real world, she was distant and irritable, always making excuses about being tired or busy. But in this virtual world, she was light-hearted, affectionate, and seemed happy. It hurt. It took him weeks to build up the nerve to confront her. He couldn't just burst out and accuse her, it didn't feel that simple. She could claim it wasn't real, just a game. How could he argue that? Was it cheating if it only happened in a virtual world? His mind raced with doubt, but deep down, he knew the truth. The emotional connection was real, even if the setting wasn't. One night, David decided to push things further. Instead of just observing from the background, he made his avatar, Alex, approach them. Laura and Kyle were sitting on the virtual couch, talking about some upcoming event in the game. Their laughter made his skin crawl. David walked his avatar right up to them, standing awkwardly in the space between them. For a moment, Laura froze. She hadn't seen this avatar before and looked confused. Kyle greeted him with a casual, "Hey, you new here?" but Laura didn't say anything. David didn't respond, just stared. It took everything in him not to scream, to type something, anything, that would blow his cover. But he didn't. Instead, he left abruptly, knowing he had made his presence felt. It was enough to rattle her. That night, in the real world, he sat on the edge of their bed, waiting for her to finish her usual VR session. When she finally emerged from her private room, she looked exhausted, but not in the way someone would after a long day of work or stress. It was the kind of exhaustion that came from emotional weight. David couldn't hold it in any longer. He asked her, his voice soft but strained, what she had been doing in VR lately. At first, she shrugged it off, saying it was just some silly new project she was working on. He didn't believe her. Without looking up from his hands, he told her about Project Eden, about the man she was seeing in the game, about everything he had seen. He spoke slowly, as though each word might break him. He expected her to deny it, to act shocked or offended that he had snooped into her virtual life. But instead, she just stood there, frozen in the doorway, the color draining from her face. For the first time in weeks, she didn't have a snappy comeback or an excuse. She was caught. Her silence only confirmed everything. When she finally spoke, she tried to explain. She told him it wasn't real, that it was just a fantasy, a harmless escape. "You don't understand, David," she said, her voice trembling. "It's just a game. It's not like I'm actually doing anything with him in real life." David could feel his anger rising, but he kept his voice calm. He told her it didn't matter if it was real or virtual. The problem wasn't the setting, it was her choosing to invest in a life that didn't include him. He had watched her give all her emotional energy to someone else, even if it was just pixels on a screen. Laura tried to defend herself. She said it was a way to cope with the stress, that she didn't mean for it to get this far. She even tried to blame him, saying that David had been too caught up in his own hobbies, his own adventures, and that she needed something for herself. She claimed that he didn't understand her anymore, that their real-world life had become boring and routine. But David couldn't accept that. He had been there for her, tried to keep their life exciting, the way it always had been. He had shared every adventure with her until she started pulling away. And now he was supposed to believe that the only reason she'd built this virtual life was because he hadn't been enough? It felt like a slap in the face. Laura insisted that it was nothing, just a fantasy that made her feel alive again. She argued that it wasn't cheating because nothing physical had happened. "It's not like I slept with him or anything," she said. "It's all in the game." David didn't know whether to laugh or cry at the absurdity of it. "It's worse," he finally said, his voice breaking. "You replaced me emotionally. You built an entire world without me in it." The weight of his words hung in the air between them, suffocating the room. Laura had no response. She had always been so quick to brush things off, to find a way to wiggle out of any confrontation, but not this time. This time, she had nothing to say. That night, David slept on the couch, feeling the crushing loneliness of realizing that the woman he loved had already left him, if not physically, then emotionally. He lay there, staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do next. Was this something they could work through? Could he forgive her? He didn't know. In the days that followed, the tension between them grew unbearable. Laura kept retreating into Project Eden, and David couldn't bring himself to confront her again. Every time she put on that headset, it felt like she was slipping further away from him. He wanted to scream, to rip the VR headset off her and demand she choose, him or this virtual world she had created. But he didn't. Instead, he began to withdraw as well. He spent more time out of the house, finding any excuse to stay busy and avoid the painful reality of what was happening. Their once adventurous life was now filled with silence, and neither of them knew how to break it. As the days passed, David found himself caught in an emotional whirlpool, spiraling deeper into confusion and hurt. He'd always prided himself on being someone who could face challenges head-on, but this situation felt different. There was no clear path forward. He wasn't dealing with an affair in the traditional sense, it was something far murkier, harder to grasp, like trying to fight a ghost. Laura continued to spend hours in Project Eden, her headset acting like a barrier between them. Every time she disappeared into that world, David felt more abandoned. He tried to go about his normal routines, taking long hikes alone or planning trips they used to enjoy together, but it wasn't the same. His mind was always occupied with the thought of what Laura was doing behind that headset. One night, as David sat at the kitchen table, staring blankly at his untouched dinner, he received a notification on his phone. It was an alert from the tracker app he had secretly installed on Laura's VR headset. At first, he hadn't planned on using it. Something about spying on her felt wrong. But after their confrontation, he needed to know more, needed to understand why she kept disappearing into that world. The notification revealed that Laura had entered Project Eden earlier than usual, which wasn't surprising. What was surprising, however, was that she wasn't just logging into the game anymore. The tracker showed that she had started spending money. David didn't know what to make of it at first. She had never mentioned in-game purchases, and he hadn't seen any strange charges on their accounts. But when he dug deeper, he found that she had opened a separate bank account. Suddenly, everything felt heavier, more real. This wasn't just a game for Laura anymore, it was something much bigger, something that required financial secrecy. The sinking feeling in David's stomach grew worse as he wondered what exactly she was paying for. Was she buying virtual items? Paying for more access to the world? Or was Kyle involved in some way? David couldn't take it anymore. His frustration, sadness, and anger had been boiling under the surface for too long. He decided it was time to confront her again, but this time, he wouldn't do it in the real world. He'd meet her in Project Eden. Maybe there, in her fantasy world, he could finally get the answers he needed. That night, David logged into the game as Alex once more. He searched the virtual map until he found them. Laura and Kyle were in the replica of their living room, laughing and talking just like before. But something was different this time. Laura wasn't just playing the role of Lila. She was dressed in a virtual wedding dress. David's heart stopped. Kyle was sitting across from her, also dressed in formal wear, as if they were preparing for some kind of ceremony. David couldn't believe what he was seeing. His wife was planning a virtual wedding, with another man. The absurdity of it would have been laughable if it hadn't been so devastating. David took a deep breath, trying to steady himself. He moved his avatar closer to them, this time not bothering to be subtle. He wanted them to see him, to know he was there. When Laura finally noticed Alex standing in the room, she froze again, her face a mask of shock. Kyle glanced at her, confused. "What's going on?" Kyle asked, his voice filled with concern. "Who is this?" David didn't type a word. He simply stood there, letting Laura stew in her guilt. He watched as she tried to come up with an explanation, stammering over her words, but it was clear that nothing she said would make a difference. She had crossed a line that David couldn't ignore. A virtual wedding, even if it wasn't real, was too far. He logged out abruptly, not wanting to hear any more of their conversation. His head was spinning, and his chest felt tight. How had their life come to this? A marriage that had once been filled with so much joy, so many adventures, was now reduced to this, Laura choosing to marry someone else in a virtual world. It wasn't just an escape for her anymore, it was an entirely separate life. The next morning, David could barely look at her. She was already in the kitchen when he came downstairs, sitting at the table with a cup of coffee. She must have sensed something was wrong because she didn't meet his eyes, just stared into her mug as if it held the answers to everything. David wanted to say something, to ask her why she was planning a virtual wedding, but the words wouldn't come. What was the point? She had made her choice. Whether she admitted it or not, she had replaced him with someone else. Not in the physical world, but in every other way that mattered. As the silence between them stretched on, Laura finally broke it. She said she needed to talk, that they couldn't keep avoiding the elephant in the room. She admitted that things had gotten out of hand with Project Eden, but she still insisted it wasn't real. She tried to convince him that it was just a fantasy, something she did to escape the pressures of real life. But David wasn't buying it. He told her about the separate bank account, about the tracker, about how he had seen everything. He laid it all out on the table, his voice calm but his heart breaking with every word. He told her that this wasn't just a fantasy, it was a betrayal. And it didn't matter if it was physical or virtual. What hurt the most was that she had shut him out of her life, chosen someone else to share her emotions with. Laura looked stunned. She tried to defend herself, saying that the virtual wedding wasn't real, that it didn't mean anything. But David could see through her lies now. She had been hiding behind the fantasy for so long that she didn't even recognize the damage it was doing to their marriage. David sat back, his hands trembling. He had to make a decision. Could he forgive her? Could they move forward from this? A part of him wanted to believe that they could, that this was just a phase, something they could work through together. But another part of him knew the truth. Laura wasn't present in their marriage anymore. She hadn't been for a long time. And no matter how much he wanted to hold on to the life they had built, it wasn't real anymore. Just like Project Eden, their marriage had become a simulation. After what felt like an eternity, David spoke again. He told Laura that he needed time. Time to think, time to figure out what their future held, if they even had a future. He didn't mention divorce, but the word hung heavy in the air between them. Laura didn't argue. She just nodded, tears welling up in her eyes. For the first time in months, David saw genuine regret on her face. But it wasn't enough. Not yet. That night, David packed a bag and left the house. He needed space, needed to clear his head and decide what came next. He wasn't sure if this was the end of their marriage, but it was definitely the end of something. As he drove away, he couldn't help but wonder how it had come to this. How had a life once filled with real adventures and love been replaced by a virtual world and lies? He didn't have the answers, but he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't stay trapped in a marriage that didn't include him anymore. David drove aimlessly for hours, replaying everything in his mind. The discovery of Project Eden, the emotional distance that had grown between them, the lies, everything seemed so surreal. It felt as if his marriage had been slowly unraveling while he was too caught up in holding on to a version of Laura that no longer existed. He eventually found himself at a small motel on the outskirts of town. It was nothing fancy, just a quiet place where he could be alone with his thoughts. He checked in, threw his bag on the bed, and sat by the window, staring out at the highway. The night stretched on, and with it came the crushing weight of reality. Laura had been his partner for over a decade. They'd built a life together, a life full of adventures, laughter, and shared dreams. But now, it was all tainted. The idea of their marriage being replaced by a virtual existence was hard to accept, but harder still was the emotional distance she had allowed to grow between them. He couldn't stop thinking about the virtual wedding, the emotional connection she had forged with Kyle. It wasn't just the fantasy that hurt, it was the fact that Laura had chosen to invest in that world instead of trying to fix what was broken between them. David wondered how long it had been this way. Had he missed the signs, or had he just been too willing to believe that they could get through anything? The next morning, David awoke to the sound of his phone buzzing on the nightstand. It was Laura. He stared at the screen for a moment, his chest tightening. He wasn't ready to talk to her yet. Not after everything that had happened. He silenced the phone and let the call go to voicemail. After a long, restless night, David decided he needed clarity. Sitting alone in a motel room wasn't going to help him figure out what came next. So, he packed his things and headed to the one place that had always brought him peace, the mountains. David had grown up in a small town surrounded by mountains, and hiking had always been his escape when life felt overwhelming. There was something about the vastness of nature that put things into perspective. As he made his way up one of the trails they used to hike together, he felt a strange mix of emotions: anger, sadness, and a deep sense of loss. He thought back to their early days together. Laura had been so full of life, always the one pushing them to go on one more adventure. They had explored countless trails, climbed peaks, and camped under the stars. The memories of those times filled him with a bittersweet nostalgia. He missed that Laura, the one who shared his love for the real world, not the woman who now sought solace in a virtual one. As he climbed higher, his thoughts became clearer. He began to realize that the woman he had fallen in love with was no longer the woman he was married to. Laura had changed, and maybe he had too. Their lives had shifted, but instead of facing it together, they had grown apart. The signs had been there all along: the late nights, the secrets, the distance, but David had ignored them, convinced that their love could survive anything. Now, he wasn't so sure. By the time he reached the top of the mountain, David felt a sense of calm wash over him. The crisp air filled his lungs, and for the first time in weeks, he felt like he could breathe. As he stood there, looking out over the vast landscape, he realized he had a choice to make. He could keep fighting for a marriage that no longer resembled what it once was, or he could let go. Letting go. The thought scared him, but it also felt like a release. Laura had already chosen to live in a world without him, even if she didn't want to admit it. And now, David had to decide if he was willing to keep fighting for someone who wasn't fully there anymore. He sat down on a rock, his mind finally quiet. He knew what he had to do. When he got back to the motel, David checked his phone. There were several missed calls from Laura, as well as a text message asking him to come home so they could talk. But David wasn't ready to go back, not yet. He needed one more conversation, but it wasn't with Laura. It was with himself. David spent the next few days reflecting on their marriage, on everything they had built together and everything they had lost. He thought about the good times, the adventures, the love they had once shared. But he also thought about the betrayal, the lies, and the emotional distance that had slowly eaten away at their relationship. He realized that, in many ways, they had been living separate lives long before Project Eden entered the picture. Laura had been retreating into her own world for months, and David had been too busy trying to hold on to the past to notice. He had been blind to the fact that their marriage was slipping through his fingers. Finally, after days of soul-searching, David made his decision. He wasn't going to keep living in a marriage built on lies and distance. He deserved more than that. They both did. With a heavy heart, David packed his bags and checked out of the motel. He wasn't sure what would happen next, but he knew one thing: he couldn't stay trapped in the past anymore. When he returned home, Laura was waiting for him. She looked exhausted, her eyes puffy from crying. She asked him if they could talk, and for the first time in days, David felt ready. He sat down across from her at the kitchen table, the same table where they had shared countless meals, laughter, and conversations. Laura apologized, but David could tell it wasn't enough. She was sorry, but the damage had already been done. The trust was broken, and no amount of apologies could fix that. David didn't want to keep rehashing the same arguments, the same excuses. He told her that he needed space, real space, not the emotional distance they had been living in. He told her that he was going to file for divorce. The words hung in the air, heavy and final. Laura didn't argue. She didn't try to change his mind. Instead, she just nodded, tears streaming down her face. She knew it was over too. David felt a strange sense of relief wash over him. It was painful, yes, but it was also freeing. He had spent so long trying to hold on to something that wasn't there anymore. Now, he could finally let go. In the weeks that followed, David began the process of rebuilding his life. He moved out of the house, finding a small apartment on the edge of town. It wasn't much, but it was a place where he could start fresh. He spent his time hiking, reconnecting with old friends, and slowly rediscovering who he was outside of his marriage. Laura stayed in the house, still caught up in Project Eden. David heard through mutual friends that she was spending even more time in the virtual world, but he no longer cared. It wasn't his burden to carry anymore. One day, while hiking a familiar trail, David stopped at the top of the mountain and looked out at the vast expanse before him. For the first time in a long time, he felt at peace. He had let go of the life he thought he wanted, and now, he was ready to embrace whatever came next. Looking back, David realized that sometimes, the hardest part of moving forward is accepting that the life you once knew is gone. But with that acceptance comes the freedom to build something new, something real. David found himself waking up early each day in his new apartment, a small but comfortable place that marked the beginning of his new life. The decision to file for divorce had weighed heavily on him, but as the days passed, he began to accept it for what it was, a necessary ending. Laura had retreated further into her virtual world, and David realized that clinging to what they once had would have only delayed the inevitable. His days became simpler. The familiar hikes he had once taken with Laura were now solitary, but instead of feeling empty, they brought him peace. He hiked the same trails, yet they felt different, more personal now, like he was reclaiming something for himself. There was a sense of freedom in not having to answer to anyone, in not constantly worrying about Laura and what she was doing in Project Eden. He began reconnecting with old friends, people he hadn't seen much during the last few years of his marriage. It felt strange at first, stepping back into the world without the weight of his relationship hanging over him. The conversations were lighter, more relaxed. No longer did he feel the pressure of pretending that everything at home was fine. For the first time in a long while, David felt like he could just be himself. But the divorce process wasn't without its challenges. Splitting up their lives was messy. Laura had agreed to let him go, but dividing their shared assets, memories, and belongings brought up painful reminders of their once happy life. The house, with all its furniture, photos, and mementos, felt more like a museum of their past than a home. David had left most of it behind, not wanting to hold on to things that no longer represented who he was. Laura's VR headset, once a symbol of their divide, still sat on the shelf when he visited the house to gather a few more of his things. It was as though she hadn't moved since he left. She wasn't living in their real home anymore, she was still lost in Project Eden, where her new life, her virtual life, had taken over. David didn't say much to her during these visits. They were polite but distant. Both of them knew that there was nothing more to say. One afternoon, after a particularly difficult session with the divorce lawyer, David decided to visit a local coffee shop he hadn't been to in years. It had always been one of his favorite spots, but during his marriage, he had stopped going. Small routines like this had faded as their life together became more complicated. Sitting there with a cup of coffee, surrounded by the hum of people going about their day, he realized just how much he had missed moments like this, simple, unburdened moments. As he sat there, watching the world move around him, David felt a surprising sense of hope. He had been carrying so much grief, so much sadness over the loss of his marriage, that he hadn't allowed himself to think about the future. But now, in this quiet moment, he began to see it. his life wasn't over. It was just different. The divorce paperwork was finalized within a few months. Laura agreed to sell the house, and they split the proceeds. David wasn't interested in keeping the home, it held too many memories that belonged to a different life. Laura seemed relieved too, knowing that her future was no longer tied to him. The sale of the house was the last thread connecting them, and once it was gone, David felt like he could truly move on. David's routine continued to change in subtle ways. He started picking up hobbies he had long abandoned: photography, cooking, even reading books that had been sitting on his shelf for years. These activities weren't distractions from the pain, they were ways to rebuild his sense of self, to rediscover the things that had once brought him joy. He wasn't the same person he had been when he and Laura first met, and that was okay. He was learning to embrace who he was now. His evenings were no longer filled with awkward silence or the sound of Laura's VR headset in the next room. Instead, David spent his time reflecting on what had happened, not with bitterness, but with a growing understanding that life was never as simple as he had once believed. People change, circumstances evolve, and sometimes, despite the love that once existed, relationships don't survive. Accepting this truth wasn't easy, but it brought a certain kind of peace. One day, while hiking his favorite trail, David paused at the top of the ridge. The view was breathtaking, and for the first time in months, he didn't feel the familiar pang of sadness that had always accompanied him to this spot. He realized that he had reached a new chapter in his life. The weight of the past was still there, but it no longer dominated his thoughts. Instead, he found himself looking forward, wondering what might come next. David's friends encouraged him to start dating again, but he wasn't in a rush. He needed time to fully heal, to get comfortable with being alone before opening his heart to someone new. He wasn't opposed to the idea, but for now, he was focused on rebuilding his life, on learning how to be happy on his own terms. Months passed, and with each passing day, David felt more grounded in his new reality. He knew that healing wasn't linear, and there would be moments of doubt and pain ahead, but he also knew that he had the strength to face them. His marriage to Laura had been a significant chapter in his life, but it wasn't the end of his story. As David looked out over the horizon that day, he understood something important: letting go didn't mean forgetting or erasing the past. It meant accepting it for what it was, a part of his journey, a part of who he had become. And as much as it had hurt, it had also made him stronger, more self-aware, and ready for whatever came next. David's future was unwritten, but for the first time in a long while, he felt ready to start writing it again. As the months passed, David's life continued to stabilize. The divorce had been finalized, the house sold, and he had gradually settled into his new apartment. It wasn't the grand adventure-filled life he and Laura once dreamed of, but it was his, and that was what mattered now. He found comfort in the simplicity of his new routines: working, hiking, reading, and reconnecting with friends he had drifted away from during his marriage. For a while, David resisted the idea of moving on romantically. Friends and family suggested dating, but the thought of opening himself up again felt overwhelming. He wasn't ready, and he knew that jumping into something too soon would only lead to more pain. The wounds from his marriage hadn't fully healed, and he needed to take time to reflect, not rush into another relationship. One day, while hiking his usual trail, he ran into someone unexpected: Emma, an old acquaintance from his past. She had been part of their group of friends years ago but had moved out of town for work. David remembered her as kind and easygoing, someone who was always quick with a joke or a smile. They hadn't kept in touch after she left, but here she was, back in town, hiking the same trail. Their conversation was natural, effortless, as if no time had passed. Emma was recently divorced as well, and they found themselves bonding over their shared experiences. There was no pressure, no expectations, just two people reconnecting and finding comfort in each other's company. They started meeting up occasionally for coffee or hikes, keeping things light and easy. It was a slow process, but David felt a sense of normalcy returning to his life. For the first time since his marriage ended, David felt hopeful about the future. He wasn't sure if he and Emma would become something more, but that wasn't the point. What mattered was that he was allowing himself to be open to new possibilities. The fear and hurt that had once consumed him were slowly fading, replaced by a quiet optimism. Meanwhile, David's relationship with Laura had shifted into something resembling cordial distance. They no longer communicated regularly, but when they did, it was civil. Laura had remained deeply invested in her virtual life, and though it still stung to think about, David had come to terms with it. She had made her choices, and he had made his. Their paths had diverged, and there was no use dwelling on what could have been. One day, out of the blue, David received a message from Laura. It was short, just a few lines, but the tone was different. She admitted that she had been lost for a long time and was trying to find her way back to reality. She apologized again, not just for the affair in Project Eden, but for how she had checked out of their marriage long before it ended. She didn't ask for forgiveness or reconciliation, she simply wanted him to know that she had reflected on her actions and regretted the pain she had caused. David read the message carefully, feeling a strange mixture of relief and sadness. It wasn't that he had been waiting for an apology, but hearing her take responsibility for her part in the collapse of their marriage gave him a sense of closure he hadn't realized he needed. He didn't respond right away, unsure of what to say, but he felt lighter, as if the last bit of weight from their past had finally lifted off his shoulders. A few days later, David replied with a simple message of his own, thanking her for reaching out, acknowledging that they had both made mistakes, and wishing her well. It wasn't dramatic or emotional. It was just the final step in letting go. With that chapter of his life truly behind him, David found himself looking forward to what lay ahead. His connection with Emma continued to grow, though they both took things slowly. There was no rush, no need to define what they had right away. David was learning to appreciate the present moment, to embrace life as it came without trying to control it. One evening, as they sat on a bench overlooking the city after a hike, David realized how far he had come. The pain of the past had faded into the background, and in its place was a quiet sense of peace. He wasn't the same person he had been when his marriage with Laura began, and that was okay. Life had changed, and so had he. But now, he felt ready to move forward, not with regret, but with hope. David's journey had taught him that healing wasn't a straight line. It was messy and painful, filled with unexpected twists and turns. But in the end, it had brought him to a place where he could finally let go of the past and embrace the future. He had learned that it was okay to start over, to rebuild, and to find happiness again, even after heartbreak. As the sun set behind the mountains, David looked over at Emma, smiling at the thought of whatever might come next. He didn't know where their relationship would go, but he knew one thing for certain: he was ready for whatever the future held. Life, with all its complications and unpredictability, had offered him a second chance, and this time, he wasn't afraid to take it. And with that, David finally closed the door on his past, walking forward into the unknown with a sense of peace and possibility.